That's a fair.
That's what I think it is. There's gotta be way more in the top tiers than that.
That is pretty expensive.
Like it's
To who?
To me. I don't know.
or it costs.
Oh, wait, maybe it is. Damn it.
It's only 10 hours a week.
So I even went as far as trying to get the test from Bill to see if it's like no animation at our
It's from the Department of Virginia.
Hey everybody, it's about that time yet again.
You did.
Let's see, so the plan today is to finish up Southeast Asia. We'll probably be able to finish it. There might be a couple things we'll have to leave for next time, but probably finish it. And then this week there's like a fall break, right? Or is that Friday?
Yeah.
That sound right to everybody? So you get a nice, I guess if Halloween is now a holiday weekend, maybe, I guess, technically. So you get a nice long holiday, Halloween weekend. Any general questions about anything before I jump into finishing up Southeast Asia? Yeah.
So we're like taking the midterm on our own?
Yes, it is similar to the quizzes. It is online, and therefore, open book, open note. Yeah.
Is that, how we have the quizzes due every Wednesday, or whatever you said usually, is the midterm will replace that quiz this week, or is it both of them like do still?
I don't have the schedule here on me. I'm trying to remember. I know it's a lot to juggle this week, so if you do need a couple extra days for any of the things, you need to wait until the end of the week. That's fine. Nothing's going to be turned off. As I mentioned before, this semester, trying to have a lot of flexibility because I know this is still chaotic times with all the COVID and everything, right? So, future semesters will get more rigorous about deadlines and stuff. And of course, obviously, our end of semester deadlines are going to have to be concrete deadlines because I got to turn grades into the dean, right? But the midterm ones, like I said, if you need a little extra time for something, send me an email, let me know. Shouldn't be a problem because there's a lot to juggle. Yeah.
So realistically, you'd like to do by Friday?
Sure. Although I know you have that day off, so maybe you don't want to do it that day. Want to get it done beforehand. In my opinion, the quizzes, similar to the midterm and final exams, I don't think they're hard considering they're open book. The questions are more difficult than they would otherwise be, but that's because I don't expect you to have memorized every single thing from the book, right? So the questions are just formatted differently. But students, midterm exam, take maybe a half hour or so, not a super huge amount of time. It's all multiple choice like the quizzes, so you already know the format and you've already kind of gone through them. Any other questions before we, all right? Southeast Asia, I talked some about the physical geography already. This is an area that involves a lot of tectonic activity, meaning, you have these major plate boundaries here, right? And plate boundaries, I don't know if any of you have taken geology or anything like that, but plate boundaries can do all kinds of things. Sometimes they're boundaries where one is being basically shoved under the other one, and that's this plate boundary, for example, where you have really, really deep areas of the ocean because they're being pushed down. You have something goes side by side, and all plate boundaries can have earthquakes, can have volcanoes, can have lots of stuff going on because they're very active geologically. And as you can see, there's a lot of ocean in this area of the world, So what that means is, well, a lot of these landforms are from volcanoes, and that's why there's a lot of volcanoes around. And you get a lot of, like, well, I think in the first day of class I talked about tsunamis, things like that. You get that kind of thing in this area in general. We're going to talk a bit about the Mekong River here. As you can see it, I think one of the questions last time someone asked me if it goes through India, but it doesn't. If you can see where it goes really close to the border there. But then the delta of the river here is this area, the bottom of Vietnam there, Laos and Cambodia. That's part of the reason why there's lots of good agriculture. Again, in this area here, that is the delta of the river. And again, a reminder, deltas of rivers, of major rivers, because they have lots of sediment coming in, they tend to have good nutrients, plenty of water, but they can also be prone to flooding because they're at such low elevations. Let's see if there's anything else about this one. Nah. As I mentioned, deltas of rivers have lots of fertile land. In this area of the world, one of the main crops is rice, right? It has kind of some of the perfect weather for rice. You have a lot of standing water. As I said before, you have a lot of nutrients coming in. Rice, as I also mentioned before, one of those crops that has not been highly mechanized. Crops that involve a lot of water. It's kind of difficult to mechanize sometimes. A lot of water and a lot of mud, so it's a lot of human work. Also because, well, there's such a rich amount of nutrients in the water and whatnot. Also the ocean in the area in general is very shallow, and what that means is the shallower the water, the more of the sun's rays can go down through the water and feed plants, which then feed animals. So there's lots of good fishing. This whole area is able to sustain very large populations and has for thousands and thousands of years. That's why there's ancient civilizations in this area. Some classic terrace farming. So you can see we need a standing water for rice. Climate of the region. In general, we have warm temperatures, we have a fair amount of precipitation. As you can see, there's part of the reason this has been clustered together as a region is because of similarities of weather and climate. The main difference being in this area, you'll have dry seasons. You don't really have too many dry seasons in the rest of the area. Let's see, I mentioned a bunch of subduction zones. This is just another map showing the different plates and where they come together. Again, that's why you'll see all these volcanoes and whatnot. A lot of the Philippines are either active volcanoes or landforms that came about through past volcanoes. Often volcanoes will just kind of have a certain lifetime to them. That is because, well, you have a volcano that is active, right, and it creates itself and it brings up lava and it creates a big island, sometimes a really, really big island. But you also get a lot of weathering, right? You get rain that is wearing, and wind and erosion will wear a mountain down through time. And often these different volcanoes, once, you'll have a hot spot is what it's called, where you'll have a volcano coming through and you'll have the plates kind of move around so that where the lava actually comes through changes through time. Well, I'll go into a lot more detail on that when I get to the chapter on the Pacific, because I have more detailed information looking at the Hawaiian chain of islands. Let's see, other physical geography things going on. Lots of storms. Let me get a picture that's bigger. Last time we talked a little bit about tropical storms hitting India, right? And yes, there's a fair amount. As you can see, the region we're talking about now, it's a magnitude higher even than what we were looking at before, right? A lot of major hurricane storms coming in. You might notice a big empty area in the center, right? I don't remember if I mentioned it. Do you guys know why there's not? You don't see a lot of hurricanes around the equator. You guys know why that is? Yeah. I think the book mentions it really quickly. Well, for hurricanes, what the ingredients for a hurricane is heat, right? So you got to have a place that has a lot of sun coming in. That's why you don't have them that go very far north and far south because it gets too cold. You also need centrifugal force. You need the spin so that the storm, as it spins, can build up. Because if it doesn't spin, it just dissipates. And so what you actually have around the equator, you have what are called the doldrums, which is just kind of a constant light rain rather than great big storms. You have to go a little bit further north and south in the equator for those things to come together. You have warm temperatures still because you haven't gone too far, but you have centrifugal force spin that creates these big hurricanes. So anyway, lots of hurricanes. This chapter talks about, we've actually in other chapters talked about the difficulty with storms in some places being more vulnerable because they're low elevations or don't have infrastructure or warning systems about hurricanes. You also have other things such as, for example, you had a major hurricane that went through Myanmar here, and Myanmar had an authoritarian government that didn't want people kind of getting into their business. So when the storm hit and it caused a major amount of damage, the government actually delayed international assistance, and it was needed. Well, it was very strongly needed, and it was needed immediately because there was tons of damage. Huge parts of cities were destroyed. A lot of people were homeless, and so usually international aid, they'll send out tents, they'll send out things to sleep with, they'll send out food, send out water, right? A lot of these things you need right away. But it was delayed, and then it was like less than the international community kind of wanted to put in. So that's something that kind of can get in the way of examples like that. Also talked about tsunamis a bit already. Pacific Ring of Fire, which includes this region, but also the entire Pacific. 90% of the world's earthquakes take place there, and it's under the Pacific, so it's water, right? And that displaces water. So you have a map here showing the same plate boundaries that we looked at before, but this one including all earthquakes that have happened in the past couple hundred years and volcanoes. And like I said, right along the plate boundaries, you see a bunch of these, right? Actually, the Philippines have so much tectonic energy and geothermal energy that they actually use geothermal as an energy source. One of the few places where they could do that kind of thing. I think they do a little bit of that in Iceland as well, but that's a difficult source of power to manage reliably. But this is why they call this the Pacific Ring of Fire, is because it's kind of a ring. The book talks about this major tsunami, and again, I think I actually showed you pictures of this from the first class. I think I talked about examples of tsunamis. But again, these areas, very low elevation and relatively stable, so a lot of people will build on these areas that are just inches above sea level. But then if you have something like a tsunami, you'll have basically an entire area is just obliterated, right? It's not even just some damage and some rain. Because again, usually you had that storm surge. Oh, actually, well, not a storm surge, because we're talking about tsunami, which isn't a storm. This map is not from the book, but I think this map is a good example of when people talk about humans first being in this area. And there are a lot of theories for a long time about how exactly people got across these big wide areas and islands and stuff. Well, during the last ice age, when a lot of the Earth's water was locked up in ice caps, well, the ocean level, we talk a lot about sea level rise in this class because we talk about climate change in the future, but the sea level used to be much lower. And the first people who came through here, they just walked for the most part, even to far out island chains, like you could walk. This was thousands of years ago, but that's how humans first came through this region. The last class I talked about, well, I showed you all a video about deforestation in the region. If you remember from the video, there's been a lot of deforestation, and in this area, it's a bit of a unique phenomena because a lot of the deforestation is being specifically put in place for oil palm plantations. Very popular product for those who are here for the video. And the method that's being used to clear the land is slash and burn agriculture, which, if you remember, classically for ancient civilizations, this was a sustainable way of farming because you have areas in the tropics that don't have a lot of nutrients. Nutrients get washed away with the rains. So if you chop down a local area, and because it's so warm, it dries out pretty fast, and you could set it on fire, use the ashes basically for fertilizer. You could do it for a few years before you move on. Slash and burn in Indonesia in the past 10 years has not been sustainable. It's been by companies who are just clearing a lot of land, and it's created so much smoke that it's often seen in satellites, caused a lot of local breathing problems. And you have a unique circumstance in Indonesia specifically because underneath a lot of the rainforest is areas that have a lot of peat, which is a lot of organic material that is built up through thousands of years. And when that stuff also catches on fire, it can just kind of simmer. And then you can obviously never really convert that area to agriculture or anything if you just kind of have simmering fires that just kind of won't go out for years and years. But that also, a peat bog, because that's organic material that has been laid down and created over thousands and thousands of years, it's a lot of carbon. And so when you burn it and you release all that carbon, right, that's worse than even just burning down the rainforest. You're burning down the rainforest and then you're burning the accumulation of lots of organic material. It just keeps on putting out carbon. So in this region we're looking at, similar to all regions that we look at, there are areas that are more developed, areas that are less developed. In general, there's a lot of migration of people moving to cities, because cities is more where the jobs are. A lot of rural areas have declining wages, less and less jobs. Some unique things about business in the area. Large parts of, especially Malaysia and Indonesia, are Islamic. And so you might not realize that this changes an industry like banking because, well, Islam teaches that interest should not be charged for lending money. Christianity taught the same thing for lots of years until it changed its mind. And so the banks there, if they invest in something, you're putting money in together, and you both either win or lose when it comes to how much money you make. Unlike in, banks over here where the bank makes money whether you win or lose in your financial gamble that you're going for. Another term from this chapter that's useful, crony capitalism. Crony capitalism, that's another one of those great terms because it just is what it sounds like. The opposite of crony capitalism would be a meritocracy where, in your government or whatnot, or in your industries, you have people who excel because of their merits and because they are successful, and that makes everyone prosperous. Crony capitalism is when instead, you appoint some relatives to positions, you have people who, are going to give you a financial payoff, appoint them to other positions. That leads to lots of, let's call it, inefficiencies inefficiencies in your government and in your industries. So that's why one of the many reasons we in general say that that's a bad thing. Talked about this main regional trade association before somewhat when I was talking about the highway system that they helped put in that was a multi-regional effort. The original association, I think I also mentioned last time, was actually put together as an anti-Chinese group. This is during the Cold War, and China was kind of being painted as the big bad guy in the neighborhood. But since then, well, they've had a lot of countries join in, and all of these countries rely on China for a fair amount of their economy. So they really had to switch their main mission statement to be something more just pro the region rather than against any one country. Hong Kong, the book talks about Hong Kong because it's basically on the border between this region and the next region we'll talk about, which is East Asia. But it's another good example of how, the old arguments that you can't have large industries or cities in the tropics. There's actually many large cities, giant cities that are in the tropics that are very, very prosperous. Singapore is another example. Lots of these places having their own unique colonial histories. Like Singapore, part of the reason they're able to be relatively prosperous is their connections to Britain, being a former colony of Britain, also being a relatively small place, and so they were able to have pretty good self-defense from any other countries that would think about invading or whatnot. Like many of the other places we're going to look at, the majority of the population are what's called the overseas Chinese. Lots of Chinese populations have moved out of China for not just decades, but for hundreds of years. Very often this would be tied to big invasions. So when the Mongolians invaded China, as they did kind of everywhere else, a lot of Chinese people moved out. When the Japanese invaded China, a lot of the Chinese people moved out, right? And these different conflicts happen. And so in this region specifically, because it's relatively near China, you have a lot more of these, Chinese who are living not in China, but still are living very much kind of like a Chinese identity, right? They form what are called ethnic enclaves, which is the sub-area of geography. Ethnic enclaves is just when you have an area where people are united by their ethnicity, but they'll be away from their kind of home area. Singapore, again, like I said, another very prosperous country. The informal economy, which comes up again and again. The informal economy being often, things that are illegal, right? But it involves lots of different things. You having a garage sale is the informal economy because it's not being regulated, right? The government isn't looking at the products you're selling. There's no worker protections. There's no getting taxes, right? There's all this stuff. It's informal. And usually things that are illegal are also informal because, they're against the law. They can't be formalized and taxed and things like that. Let's see. I don't know if you've ever read about the term the Golden Triangle as far as opium production and use. As you can see, there's, a major flow through a lot of different places, but they kind of have a similar origin area. Part of that time that Myanmar didn't want people to come in to help out when there was major damage from that major hurricane. No small part of that is because the local government is making a lot of money on something that they kind of don't want people to stick their noses in, right? Informal economy. I feel like this topic comes up in every chapter, so you don't need more details about it. Outside of the fact that a lot of economists had just assumed that the informal economy, as places would develop, would just vanish. But in many ways, as a place develops, there's more economic activity, and often there's kind of yet more avenues for the informal economy to evolve in different ways, especially if you have things that are made illegal that people still want to get. The informal economy, kind of one of the main things that we look at in geography is who's vulnerable, who's working in the informal economy. Usually that is the workers, because it's the informal economy, they don't have any kind of worker protections. There's no sick leave, there's none of that, right? It's the informal economy. Most people who are working in the informal economy, women, young people, meaning very often children, internal migrants, international immigrants. Another term from this chapter, was a big term in geography, but it's not really used that much. Primate cities, what does that mean? There used to be a big area in geography where they felt that every country, it seemed, had one main city, right? And this theory was just called the primate cities theory. In this region, this comes up because all the countries are kind of small enough that there usually is one main city. And what that means is, in that entire country, well, as rural jobs decline and incomes from rural jobs decline, people moving to cities, right? When we talk about shanty towns and overpopulation, we're not really talking about people having too many kids and there being overpopulation. We're talking about cities that have not been built for the stress of all these people moving from rural areas into them, right? They can't keep up with all the people moving to the cities. So in primate cities, what that means is in these different countries, you have one big city that everyone is moving to. Now, the whole theory of primate cities was not something that is true for much larger countries. So this little theory turned out to not always be the case. You look at a country like Russia, sure, Moscow is the main city, but they have other like really major cities. In the United States, for example, one person might say, well, Washington, D.C. is our main city. Someone else would say, no, it's L.A., and someone else would say, no, it's New York. Another person would say someplace else, right? And these cities are all kind of, well, there isn't one main city that is the city, right? All right. Now, this chapter also talks about migration theory. Migration theory just says that, well, what's kind of obvious, there are push and pull factors for migration. There are push factors, like let's say you're living somewhere and there's an invasion, right? That's a push factor. I want to get out of here. Pull factors, well, where are you going to go? What place is pulling you? Well, might be you know of a place that has been relatively peaceful and prosperous, and so you decide to move there, right? Push and pull factors. In these examples, looking at primate cities, again, the push and pull factors are just jobs going away in rural areas, and jobs being, there being more of them in the cities. But a lot of people in the rural areas, they just don't have a choice. If you're living in a rural area and the money's dried up and you can't feed yourselves, that's when people move to the cities. And when they've gotten to that point, it's not like they have a lot of resources when they do move to the cities. They have the clothes on their back, maybe they have a couple animals, and then they just move. But that's why you have shanty towns, is because then people try to put together a place to live out of whatever they can find. Transnational identities, another term in this chapter, just talks about the complexity of, well, when people move to a new place, like when I talk about the international Chinese, right, who have moved to areas in Southeast Asia, they have that kind of conflict of you're living in your new country and you may really like your new country and really want to identify with the people in the country, but you don't want to lose your old identity either, right? So people have these dual identities that they try to negotiate and balance. So yeah, the shanty towns and slums, right? About 1 billion people are living in these areas that are surrounding major cities. And again, the primate cities in this region are the ones that are getting a lot of these. Map of proportion of people living in these urban slums. Could be called suburban even because they're the areas around the cities. You very often have wealthier people who are living in the central cities with lots of resources and infrastructure and everything else. And the people living on the outside who will put together housing from, again, whatever they could find, where they could put together. And then a lot of them working in the informal economy in different ways, right? Are these both Manila? Yeah. Manila, right, the outside of the city, and then within the center of the city. This chapter also talked about ancient migrations that people have looked at using DNA, which is a really interesting thing because there's lots of populations that have moved around that, when they move, they can often will completely change their culture and customs, but of course you don't change your DNA, and so it's often through this type of new science that people have been able to look at ancient migrations. And so what does this mean? Well, the populations of humans that came out of Africa that came to this area, basically in a nutshell, what this said was that they stayed along the coasts mostly, which makes sense if you have populations moving around. If you're staying along the coasts, you have access to food as you move around. Yeah, that's about all that section talked about. Populations in this area, as you can see, areas such as the Philippines have some high populations. The delta here of the Mekong River has some high populations. This area here is kind of along mountains. You have less people in general. And then down here in, Indonesia, you can see that most of the population are on this kind of one large island. The rest of the population is dispersed. There was actually a time about 15 years ago, the somewhat militarized rulers of Indonesia started forcefully moving people who were political enemies to far out islands to try to kind of take away their relative power. Anything else about this one? We're doing okay. All right. Languages of Southeast Asia. Well, there's a lot of languages. As you can see, there's some main groupings of languages. The languages, similar to when we look at how the religions have dispersed, very often the languages spread around through trading networks, or sometimes they're parts of kind of ancient empires that kind of grew or shrunk through time. And then just examples of the broader, how languages spread through these very dispersed islands. And actually these parts will be more in a later chapter. So let's see, some interesting things about language, specifically in Indonesia. If you remember, we've talked about lingua franca before. That's if you have a common language that is used, right? So, when we talk about ancient Rome and everyone using Latin, today some people say English is one of the more widely used languages that people will use. And in Indonesia, it was a conscious choice, to specifically not use the language of what had been a colonizer for many years, Dutch, right? And plenty of places do decide to use the language of their colonizer because often there'll be so many different languages that if everyone kind of knows one, they'll just stick with it. But everyone had already learned Indonesian before colonization. So then actually when they came to want to, decolonize and get rid of the colonizers' influence altogether, a lot of the rebellions Well, they built their nationalism around having this unified language, and so they very specifically wanted to not speak Dutch. Let's see. And the choice to not use Indonesian, right? If they had chosen Dutch, well, then the people who had been kind of in power during colonialism would still have that advantage. If they used Javanese, if you saw there's large population that were on Java, that one island, right? Well, if they use that language, that would really privilege people in that area alone, right? And the other areas would not feel as included. If they use Indonesian, then it's something that kind of everyone in the country knows enough that they can interact, right? Very conscious decision to choose that language. Now, though Indonesian is a form of Malay, Malaysia itself, well, they had a whole different kind of set of circumstances, right? They had, well, could have used Chinese because large amount of the population is Chinese, but they instead chose to use English, which was the language of the colonizer. But, well, they decided to use that because everyone had that language that they knew it relatively well. But this does give certain people power over others, right? So the choices that they're made. It's more and more complicated than one might think of choosing a place's languages. You can see there's lots of places that have multiple languages. Philippines, for example, has lots of local dialects, but because they were a Spain colony for many years, a lot of Spanish used. And then the US has been kind of the main power there, basically ever since the Second World War. So English is very widely used, right? Oh, I just said this. All right. Catching up with myself. A lot of English schools are popular because, again, English is being considered a bit more of an international language. You know, it's like when I showed you Bollywood and the songs were all English, but then the dialogue is a mix. Interestingly, when they're having these schools set up, often American accents are a bit more popular. English accents sometimes are difficult to do, and they're just not considered as easy to understand, right? It's very strongly accented. Religions in Southeast Asia. Well, this has been a lot for you guys to take in. Let me think. Should I keep on going? All right, I think I'm gonna keep going. So, before colonization by European powers, there had been lots of different groups that had moved through here through time, lots of religions, and before Europeans came in, lots of the specific cities, well, they were centered on their different religions, right? So you had Hinduism that came through, and you'd have Hindu temples that were the center of kind of regional governments. You had Islamic traders coming in, and they were bringing their religion, and then you'd have different sultans in different areas that again would be different regional trading powers. You had Buddhism come through and had a similar thing, and so you had lots of the different kind of what would be called city-states that had local religious, and a lot of them, they made their money through trade, because there was a lot of trade for spices and stuff through here. So there's been a wide diaspora of religions throughout the area, and some of these, you can see the residue of the Spanish over here in the Philippines, because you have so many Roman Catholic. Let's see, you have some traditional beliefs, right? These tend to be some of the older areas, people who settled along here and did international trade and stuff, right? They converted to Islam during the big time that there was a lot of trade with the area, but that didn't quite get into these regions. Similar thing happened here where you had religions kind of come in, but you had the older religions kind of off in the mountains. Again, this is an example of one of those city-states and what their centers were like. Usually big religious temples. Islam spread in this region in just about every different way that religion can spread. Hierarchically through places that were trading ports that were making kind of more or less money. Once those were set up and people were just kind of discussing what the religion is, you had lots of people who were converting. Hierarchically, some of these areas would then kind of declare special rules within different geographies that people would have to basically convert or move out. And a lot of people just found it to their advantage to convert, because then they could just keep doing business and living where they had lived. There's another map from the book that just shows just all kinds of ins and outs of how this all happened. I'm not going to go through every different diaspora and nook and cranny. Back to the topic of the overseas Chinese. As I mentioned, you have lots of different waves of migration, very often tied to different large invasions that happened in China, right? And sometimes they were internal conflicts or civil wars or different things that would happen that people would be like, well, I'm out of here. And this has happened pretty regularly through time. And when the populations move out, they will keep their trade networks with China. And so that's one of the reasons why the Chinese who have moved and live in different areas in this region, they still often have kind of the main economic clout in their region because they still have those contacts with China for trade. Again, moving throughout the entire region, I can talk about every in and out. Talked about enclaves, ethnic enclaves before. Didn't specifically mention chain migration. Chain migration, it's, again, another one of those good terms that is what it sounds like. If you have a population, there's an emergency in China, right? Like there's an invasion, people want to move out. Well, people will talk to each other and say, well, who do you know who's moved before? And it's like, oh, well, I have some family who live over here and they've done really well. Well, then they will help us get on our feet if we move there. It's like, sure. And so you move there and you become prosperous, and then you let other people know your experience. Chain migration, right? That's why you have different groups of immigrants, like in the United States. You have different groups that are kind of different pockets in different places here and there. We have, in the Twin Cities, we have a cluster of Somali, cluster of Ethiopian, cluster of Hmong populations, right? And these are different than other local states that have different groups, right? Chain migration. Talked about this a little bit before. In this region in general, as I said, the rural jobs are losing more and more money, so people are moving to cities for work. And what else do you do? Because a lot of the cities are filling up and they don't have as much work as there are people coming in and looking for work. So plenty of people, specifically in this region, work in different countries, right? Very often, maybe if you take a cruise somewhere, you might notice that the crew are all from countries within Southeast Asia. That's not unusual. The merchant marine, a lot of people will work in the merchant marine, partially because the merchant marine, what they use for wages is they look at the average wage of a home country. So people in Southeast Asia, usually their average wages in their home country are quite low, so they're able to get merchant marine jobs. There's also what's in general called the maid trade, which is as it sounds, a lot of people from this area moving to other countries where they work sometimes as maids or different things like that. And this can be a major source of money back in their home country. Indonesian women in Saudi Arabia send $2.5 billion in remittances. Remittances is that money that you send back home. And so a lot of people are supporting their home populations through work abroad. But again, a reminder of the difficulty of this type of work. An Indonesian person living in Saudi Arabia working. If they're lucky, maybe it's all fine and they get a good wage and they send money back and it's all good. Sometimes maybe they'll have an employer who's a terrible person and it's a very bad experience. Sometimes it'll be even worse than that. You'll have an employer who's outright abusive and the person doesn't have any resource because they're not a citizen of Saudi Arabia. Laws in Saudi Arabia are there to protect Saudi Arabians and not people who are there working from other countries. So they could just have lots of problems, right? Lots of problems. Actually, I'm going to have you guys work on some questions, and I'm going to have you self-assemble again. Let's see here. Not that big. Sure. All right, actually this is a bigger group than I thought. But I'm gonna let you self-assemble. Groups of 4 to 7 people each in these groups. Creative and critical thinking questions 5, 6, and 10 should be enough time. 5, 6, and 10. All right, self-assemble. No groups larger than 7. So relatively large groups are possible.